Welcome to our hundreds of Zoom participants from the Washington area and from around the world. The Haberman Institute is now entering our fifth decade of providing high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. Your continued contributions make these presentations possible. I'm very excited about future programs. Here are the next two. On Thursday, November 14th, our Psychology and Religion series, Curiosity versus Faith, the Moral Implications of Questioning, Dr. Larissa Heifetz Solomon, who's an associate professor of psychology at Columbia University, where she studies how children and adults think about right and wrong. And on Monday, November 18th, The Nazi Titanic, the shocking little-known story of the final days of the Holocaust, will be presented by Dr. Robert Watson, who's professor of history at Lynn University in Florida. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Rabbi Professor Michael Berenbaum, who's invited back to the Haberman Institute because our audience wanted us to. Scholar and teacher of history, especially related to the Holocaust, developer of museums across the world, especially the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum here in Washington. The author and editor of 22 books and hundreds of articles, the executive editor of the second edition of Encyclopedia Judaica, probably the Haberman Institute's only speaker whose many films have earned more than a dozen Emmys and 4 Academy Awards. He is currently Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at American Jewish University in Los Angeles and director of the Siggy Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust. Adina and I have had the pleasure of knowing our speaker and following his career since he was about 11 or 12 years old in Camp Ramah in Connecticut, where we taught him swimming. Tonight's subject, perhaps the most important topic in Jewish life today, whither do we go? The challenges of post-October 7th Jewish life. Mooney, the Zoom podium is all yours.
Thank you very much, Sandy. I've known Sandy since I was a child, and Sandy and Adina taught me to swim, and Sandy's brother David taught me to canoe, and I've also worked with Sandy's daughter-in-law, who's terrific. So this is a family occasion. The other thing I'd like to say is I had the privilege of knowing and working with Rabbi Joshua Haberman for many years when I lived in Washington. And he really was a jewel of the Washington rabbinate and an extraordinary man. And I am honored to participate in this event in his honor as part of the Haberman Institute, and also to have a little role in preserving his marvelous legacy. So thank you very much for having me. Let me begin by saying I'm not going to give you good news. And my task as a historian, and especially as a historian who deals with the Holocaust, is to confront the reality that we face. So I want to begin by saying, let's talk historically as to where we are at this moment. The Jewish people made 3 decisions in 1945. And when I say the Jewish people made 3 decisions, it's not like they sat down, gathered together, and made decisions. But existentially, if you look at the direction in which we went in the aftermath of this, 3 decisions were made. All of them shaped the last 80 years of our existence. The first decision is that Jews decided to remain Jews. I want to give you a visceral example of this, and it's probably fitting that we do it during the World Series time. I interviewed a man by the name of the late Rabbi Arnold Whither. Rabbi Arnold Whither was a mole, and he was the mole in Boston, and because he was the mole in Boston, he had developed a nickname with no respect for the New York Yankees called the Yankee Clipper. And I once asked Rabbi Whither, tell me, where did you learn to be a mole? And I was shocked by the answer. He said, I learned to be a mole in Bergen-Belsen. And I scratched my head and I said, this is a story. What do you mean you learned to be a mole in Bergen-Belsen? In 1946, Bergen-Belsen, which was a displaced persons camp, adjacent to the old concentration camp, and the old concentration camp had to be burned down in its entirety because the typhus epidemic was so great that 13,000 people died after liberation, despite the heroic efforts of the British Army. And 9, 10, 12 months later, Jews were circumcising their sons in Bergen-Belsen and circumcising the very few children, men, boys, who survived the Holocaust and who were not circumcised in 1941, 42, 43, and 44, because if a child was circumcised, that was a sentence of death. And if a man was demanded to lower his trousers, it was a sentence of death. So the Jews made in Bergen-Belsen two very major decisions. Number one, they decided that they would bring children into the world. And Bergen-Belsen had the highest birth rate in all of Europe in 1946. Part of that had to do with the fact that these were young people who had survived. They had been through absolutely the worst imaginable in human history, and they wanted to respond to death by creating life. But the second thing is really something to pay attention to, which is they decided to create Jewish life and to dare to circumcise their sons without knowing where they would live, without knowing what shape the world would take, and making an indelible mark of the covenant on them. Not all Jews decided to remain Jews. Let's think of Madeleine Albright's family. And I'm not blaming Madeleine Albright, who was a colleague of mine at Georgetown for many years. I joked that I knew Madeleine Albright before she was Madeleine Albright. But her family decided in the aftermath of the Holocaust, don't go near Jewish life. Don't go there, don't touch it. It was the third rail of family experience. And Madeleine, who was exceedingly bright, could have Jewish cousins and not realize that she was of Jewish origin, because Judaism and Jewishness became the third rail of family experience, not out of anti-Semitism, but out of caution. I'm in Poland today, and if you look at the history of Poland, the Jews who decided to stay in Poland in 46, 47, and 48 after Bricha, the Jews who didn't leave and weren't expelled in 57 or 68, essentially made a decision not to remain Jewish anymore, or not to transmit it, to do it clandestinely. And one of the great miracles of Soviet Jewry, whom we had the privilege of helping to save, is that even after 30, 40, and 50 years of communism, they did not want to sever their ties with the Jewish people. They decided to remain Jewish. So the first decision Jews made was that they were going to remain Jewish. An incredible decision. They could have said, the hell with the world. The world doesn't deserve the Jewish people. The hell with the danger of being Jewish. Let's try to assimilate, acculturate in whatever way, manner, or form. And they could have decided, this is not a world in which you bring children into. Let's end the Jewish narrative. The second decision they made is a decision that my late, very distinguished colleague who died last week at the age of 98, Yehuda Bauer, called the Zionist decision. They said that the fate of the Jewish people could be secured with a state, an army, a flag, and an anthem. And Zionism won out essentially because it was the option that they thought and we thought could secure the Jewish people, a free people in their own land, capable of defending themselves. And the third option is the option of diaspora Jewry, most especially of North American Jewry, that Jewish life could be preserved in communities that respected human rights, human dignity, that had freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and that were prepared to what? To, among those freedoms, respect the freedom of the Jewish people to be Jews. I want to argue that we now are insecure, not about the decision to be Jews, but about the decision as to whether the Jewish people can be protected in the land of Israel, and whether indeed Jewish rights will be protected in democracies that seemingly are floundering and seemingly are less secure than they used to be. And many of us are wondering if the golden age of American Jewry has ended. And consequently, we are at a turning point in Jewish history. And we may be entering what my colleague Yossi Klein Halevi has said, the post-Holocaust era, the post-Holocaust era of the Jewish people, where the two main decisions, the two main driving engines that determine the last 75, 80 years of Jewish history are now dramatically insecure. Let's start with Israel, and I say what I'm about to say about Israel, not with any sense of joy and not with any sense of of um, excitement, but merely to recognize the reality. What happened on October 7th was simply, not simply, was basically what we would call a pogrom. And a series of pogroms, the most difficult day in Jewish history since the Shoah, the day in which more Jews were killed than any other day since the Shoah, but it was a pogrom. And a pogrom normally was conducted when marauding gangs attacked Jews, and they attacked Jews because of anti-Semitism, because of venom, because of hatred, because of all sorts of things. That's in continuity. And the government in charge either was indifferent to the fate of the Jews, or the government in charge, if it wasn't indifferent, actively collaborated with those who were marauding against the Jews and did not stop it and the like. That was not supposed to happen in a Jewish country with a Jewish government. And the shock of that, the shock that the Jewish people could not protect each other and could not be protected by their government, is a shock that has left Israel in a continuous state of, I wouldn't say post-traumatic stress syndrome, but I would say traumatic stress syndrome. And I've been to Israel several times since October 7th. October 7th, ironically, was the birthday of my late sister, who passed away in the last couple of months. And we were going to Israel to celebrate her October 7th birthday. We were going right after October 7th because it was Chag. And therefore, when I say October 7th, I have a double sense of there. But we were there in the immediate aftermath. And all of a sudden, you had the sense that the people, the government of Israel could not protect the Jewish people. And now we have something else which is incredible. After a year of fighting and a year of battle, the Jewish people are in exile in their own land. And that is, they are refugees in the north, they are refugees in the southwest. They cannot return to their homes. We have had the privilege in Los Angeles of something that should be brought to Washington, which is this incredible museum exhibition on Nova, on the Nova Festival. And if you go through the exhibition, and remember, I'm a museum person, so I go through exhibitions very carefully. If you go through the exhibition, you come away horrified, shocked, and infuriated that for hours the government of Israel was absent. The army, which has helicopters and planes which can reach 1,000 miles away, which can set off pagers that wound the infrastructure of Hezbollah, that can attack Iran and destroy so much. The government was not there. The army was not there. The police were not there. And what we discovered, which was something quite astounding, is that the people of Israel are much greater than its government. And the only people who showed up in the immediate aftermath of the of both the Nova Festival and also the pogroms that took place in the area around Gaza, the only people who showed up were volunteers who got in their cars, got in their jeeps, got in their trucks, took their pistols, and came to the rescue of their fellow Jews. That was not something that was supposed to happen. And we have to ask ourselves the question, and it will be asked at some point whenever this terrible series of wars ends, why did that happen? How did that happen? But the basic understanding is that we thought that powerless, we learned from the Shoah that powerless invites victimization. And we have now seen that power does not necessarily protect unless you have an effective government that is committed to protecting. We've discovered something wonderful, which every Israeli is pointing to, which is the people of Israel are greater than its government. But we've discovered something else, which is that only an anti-Semite could believe, and I say this with pain in my soul, only an anti-Semite could believe that the people of Israel have the government it deserves. So all of a sudden, and what we've seen as well is that Israel, which we thought for an entire generation could quench the flames of anti-Semitism, can incredibly fuel the fire. And consequently, there's no sense now that Jews are safe in their homes, in their homeland, even though they are protected by a brilliant and effective and strong army. Strength is not, as it were, the magic bullet that can protect the Jewish people. That is an existential crisis for the Jewish people throughout the world. I'm in Poland. I was in London yesterday en route to Poland, and I meet a young man who has a Jewish star, and he sees that I'm wearing Bring Them Home. And he says, well, you understand the problem with Bring Them Home is we have an existential problem. And I was reminded of and the third Jewish fellow came in, and I was reminded of a terrible joke from the Shoah, which is that four Jews are standing on a corner. One Jew says, oi, the other Jew says, oi, oi. The third Jew says, oi, oi, oi. And the fourth Jew says, gentlemen, if we're going to talk politics all day, I'm leaving. And that is the anguish of Jewish history has returned. And we now have a terrible situation in which Israel is now in 4 or 5 active wars with a whole range of tactics, but not really a strategy. And we're living in a time of existential insecurity for the state of Israel. And the most we can say is that Israel is refighting its war for independence with much graver consequences than ever before, because the amount of weapons and power arrayed against it, etc. We also have a situation in which, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, in which the Holocaust is now used not as a protection against anti-Semitism, but as a vehicle to bring about anti-Semitism. Let's talk about the American situation. And to do that, I want to focus on 4 words to be able to understand contemporary anti-Semitism. I want you to think of the words. I'm going to bring them up on the screen. You'll forgive me for a second. It's going to take a brief moment. I want you to think of 4 words for in a moment, and I want you to distinguish between source, goal, priority, stability. Let's repeat the words source, goal, priority, and stability. Anti-Semitism differs as to its source. There is religious anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, social anti-Semitism, cultural anti-Semitism, economic anti-Semitism, and racial anti-Semitism. That's its source. Depending on its source, that is a difference of goals. If you have religious anti-Semitism, the goal of religious anti-Semitism is to convert the Jews. And we've seen that all along. Interestingly enough, one of the changes brought about by the current Pope is the elimination of the mission to the Jews. He's come to the perspective that Jews are fine with their own covenant and Catholics need not convert the Jews. But that's not true in terms of the basic elements of religious anti-Semitism, Christian and Muslim. In both dimensions, the goal is conversion. Political anti-Semitism has a different goal. Political anti-Semitism is the diminishment or the elimination of Jewish political power. The best words we can hear for that is the chant that we saw in Charlotte, Virginia, in Charlottesville, Virginia, in which they said the Jews will not replace us, which is the accusation that Jews are involved in a replacement theory to take over and transform American politics, which goes in one of 2 directions. Either Jews are the source and the secret cabal of taking it over, or else Jews are supporting policy that is going to destroy America as we know it. And some of the elements involved in that, you see the accusation against George Soros. You see the accusation made about the Rothschilds starting forest fires from laser, by lasers from out of space in California, and the idea of the replacement theory, which we're going to get to. Religious anti-Semitism, the goal is conversion. Political anti-Semitism, the goal is the diminishment of Jewish political power. Economic anti-Semitism is the exclusion of Jews from the economic life and from economic control of the United States or whatever country they're in. And that we all know that is the barriers that were faced 2 generations ago by our parents and grandparents when Jews could not get certain jobs, could not work in certain industries. There was a glass ceiling, there was a limitation as to how far Jews could go. And the idea is to keep them in their place and to limit their economic influence. Cultural anti-Semitism, the best example of that is Richard Wagner's writing on Jewish music and on the role of Jewish music. Another example of that is what Germany had with regard to degenerate art. And we enjoyed a very dramatic way in which Jews became part of the mainstream of the cultural landscape of America in our generation and the generation that preceded us. Jewish comedy was mainstream. Jewish shows were mainstream. Schindler's List could go into the theaters. The docudrama The Holocaust could appear on television. Um, Seinfeld could appear. Uh, Larry David's Curb Your Enthusiasm could appear. Writing in America included Philip Roth, Norman Mailer, Elie Wiesel, Cynthia Ozick. In every form of Jewish cultural participation, the Jews were mainstream in American culture. And those of us who are watching the way in which Israeli television has made it in America culturally find that even Israeli comedy and Israeli issues can make it as part of the mainstream of American cultural life. And the idea of cultural exclusion becomes something that's very important. Social anti-Semitism, we all know. When I'm going to use there are Jewish hospitals because Jewish doctors could not practice in general hospitals, and Jewish patients could not be treated as Jews in general hospitals. Groucho Marx, with regard to social anti-Semitism, said, "I would never want to belong to a club that would have me as a member." And social anti-Semitism also meant what we used to call the 5 o'clock shadow, which is you could work with Jews, but after 5 o'clock, everybody went to their own kind and did not mingle. And it also meant the collapse of social anti-Semitism also led dramatically to a significant increase in the intermarriage rate. I was an undergraduate assistant to a fellow by the name of Eric Rosenthal in 1967 when he predicted an intermarriage rate of 25%, and it became a major scandal throughout the Jewish world. And everybody today would celebrate an intermarriage rate of 25%. But social anti-Semitism meant an exclusion from the social context. There's a wonderful example brought in Charles Silverman's book, A Certain People, of a man by the name of Irving Shapiro, who broke social anti-Semitism and the economic implications of social anti-Semitism when he was at DuPont, which was then a deeply anti-Semitic company. Head of his, he came as an assistant general counsel. General counsel came to him and said, "I think it's, if you want to advance in this company, you're best off changing your name." He came back a day later and said, "Here are 2 tickets to Detroit. I want you to go to Detroit with me. Why do I want to go to Detroit? I want you to tell my father that the name that he brought me into the world is not good enough for me to carry on." They then said, "We don't normally allow you guys into this club, but we'll make an exception to you." He responded, "I don't play golf," and joined the Jewish Country Club later, which then meant at that point that people in Wilmington, Delaware wanted to join the Jewish Country Club because as he became the CEO, they wanted to be able to see him in informal context, most especially business leaders. And he then became national chairman of UJA precisely to show that one could be a business leader and a Jew and socially integrated all at the same time. Racial anti-Semitism was the Nazi brand of anti-Semitism. Why was it racial? With all due respects to Whoopi Goldberg, who didn't understand it, because she understood race only in black-white terms. The basic element of racial anti-Semitism was Jews were judged by the religion of their grandparents by the nature of Jewish blood, and Jewish blood was considered cancerous. And as a doctor, Sandy knows very well that you remove cancer. And therefore, what the Nazis saw they were doing was medicalized killing. What they even used the term for it was healing by killing. And that is that the elimination of Jews was essential to the safety of the German people and the protection of German blood. And consequently, the Jews were regarded as what? Racially not acceptable. They were the lowest of the totem pole. So again, let's go back. Anti-Semitism differs as to its source. It differs as to its goal. And the third element of anti-Semitism, which is most important, especially in the United States, is that anti-Semitism differs as to its priority. Why have Jews been safe in the United States? Not because there has not been anti-Semitism, but for a combination of two things. Anti-Semitism was never the number one priority of American venom and American hatred, still not. And the second is because law provided for freedom of religion, and that ultimately in the United States became freedom for religion. What is different about America and Nazi Germany? In Nazi Germany, anti-Semitism was the number 1, 2, 3, 4 priority. And if I were given another hour, which I'm not going to take, I could show you that, first of all, there was a seamless record in Adolf Hitler's writings from 1919 to the last words he wrote in 1945 of anti-Semitism, joining the German people not to forget about the Jewish problem. And secondly, the Germans fought two wars. They fought a racial war and a world war. They fought what Lucy Davidovich called the war against the Jews. And when the two came into conflict, very often priority was given to the racial war. Let me just make the case very briefly. The two greatest moments of peril for the Jews in Nazi Germany and in countries occupied by Nazi Germany were 1942 and 1944. What was 1942? 1942 was the period of time in which you had murder by bullets, the Einsatzgruppen, and the murdering bands taking place in German-occupied areas of the Soviet Union, and you had the development of the concentration camps that came online in 1942. That was also the time when the Germans were fighting in the winter of the Soviet Union for their lives and were facing significant wars of loss and attrition, and yet trains that could have been used to bring soldiers to the front, to bring material back, to bring the wounded back, were diverted and used to transport Jews to their death. The second time was what happened to Hungarian Jewry in 1944. In 1944, Germany was facing two battles: a battle in the east against Soviet forces that were advancing toward Berlin, and a battle against American and Allied forces that were moving from North Africa to Italy and ultimately were moving on continental Europe. And precisely at that point, that's when Germany moved against the Hungarian Jews. They invaded Hungary on March 19th. They ghettoized the Jews in March and April. And between the 15th of May and the 8th of July, they deported 437,402 Jews, primarily to Birkenau, where they were killed. 80% were killed upon arrival. So in that sense, it was the number one priority. What is unique now about the prioritization is that anti-Semitism in the United States is not the highest priority, as we can see by what happened yesterday, for example, in Madison, what happened yesterday or Saturday night in Madison Square Garden. There are other groups that are much higher on the totem pole, with the exception of the university, where the more strong DEI is, the more inclusive it is and the more responsive it is to groups that were normally on the highest priority of rage and antagonism for hatred all of a sudden, the one group that now is number one in the university are the Jews, precisely because they're not included in DEI and their priority switches. What is also, there are three elements that are different about contemporary anti-Semitism in the United States, and I would also say in North America and generally. Number one is we have the internet, which means that, first of all, the internet is allowing us to speak. We have, more than 200 people listening to me. I'm in Poland, you're all over Washington. We can communicate with each other, and we can communicate virtually for free with each other. We have more power in this than brought the atomic bomb to humanity in 1944. So the internet allows you to broadcast all over the world, to have worldwide contacts, and to have a cabal. And the social networks that are involved mean that you can no longer quarantine hatred. And if you can no longer quarantine hatred, it means that you have communities of haters who live together and interact with each other and form a global unity and a sense of community, a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose and a sense of shared values. And that becomes enormously important when that is geared toward any form of hatred. Ironically, I can prove to you that there is statistically a significantly lower percentage of anti-Semites in the United States than there was 30 and 40 and 50 years ago, and certainly 70 and 80 years ago. But that doesn't mean that anti-Semitism is on the decline. It just means it engages and involves fewer people with greater intensity. And the last element, remember, we've gone for the words. The words are source, goal, priority, and the last is stability. Stability is essential. It is axiomatic that the more stable a society is, the more secure its Jewish community. The reverse is also the case. The less stable a society is, the less secure its Jewish community. And we Jews have become, in one sense, over generations, what we could call the canary in the mine. Where there is limited oxygen in the mine, the canary feels it first. And the moment you see what happens to the canary, the miners know to what? To get out and to leave. If you look at what's happening to the Jews, you can measure the stability of society by what happens with regard to the Jews. Now, that indicates also that we live in a moment of great instability. 4 years ago, one could have said we had a health crisis that led to an economic crisis that led to a political crisis. We had a diminishment of the guardrails of society, an introduction of venom, a legitimation of hatred. We had all of these elements operating in American society. We're also at a very particular point where we have great divisions because we're moving from a manufactured and resource-based society to a knowledge-based society. And that means that there are people who are included in the knowledge-based society and people who are losers of this globalization and knowledge-based society. And if you look at the demographics of it, you can see the divisions, you can see regional divisions, you can see divisions in terms of education, in terms of work, in terms of participation. And you also have the legitimation of hatred. Now, the Jews are caught in a very particular situation at this point, which is that the extreme left and the extreme right are both targeting Jews. The extreme left, we understand with whatever it wants to say with regard to the attack on Israel, and we'll speak for one moment about what the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and the extreme right, which is looking for a resurgence of Christian nationalist America, which doesn't have a particular place of honor for the Jews, certainly not a particular place for Jews who espouse liberal values. We have one advantage in that situation, which is because they differ significantly on immigration, they can't unite in terms of the way in which extremists generally unite. Let me talk for a brief moment about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. One of the ways of distinguishing that is, what is the difference between legitimate criticism of the state of Israel and anti-Semitism? Natan Sharansky gave us a phrase to be able to use with regard to that. It's called the 3 Ds: double standards, delegitimation, demonization. Double standards are, if you judge the world by one standard and you judge Israel by another, then you are coming close to, you are coming in the vicinity of, you are engaging with, you are near to, you are what? Close to anti-Semitism. So, for example, if the bombing of Dresden was legitimate, but bombing by Israel is illegitimate, then, as it were, you're using double standards. If what we did in Mosul is fine, what we Americans did in Mosul is fine, but what Israel did in Gaza is not fine, then you're engaging again in double standards. That's not to say what we did in Mosul is fine or what Israel did in Gaza is fine. It's to say that if you accept one but you negate the other, you're engaging in double standards. The second issue is delegitimation. If Israel lives in a place where it has disempowered the native society, the indigenous people, which is the accusation against Israel, so do 27 different countries in the world today, including the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Mexico, etc., etc. I can go through all the countries. We need not do that at this point, but look at Google or look at AI and you'll get a list of the countries. If that means Israel has no right to exist, the United States has no right to exist, Canada has no right to exist, Australia has no right to exist, New Zealand has no right to exist, Mexico has no right to exist, certain African countries have no right to exist, etc., etc. The point is that you move from Israel has done X, Y, and Z, it is illegitimate, should not exist. That ends up being the broad elements of anti-Semitism. The third element is the most difficult and the most pernicious, which is the notion of demonization. That Israel is not only doing something that is wrong, as all human beings are capable of doing and all human entities are capable of doing, but Israel is the source of the demonic. It's the source of the evil. You hear that in extremes on left and right. You hear that in chants that are being said on university campuses and occupation. And the idea that you hear that when you, for example, have the idea that Israel kills young Palestinian children to harvest their organs. In all sorts of ways, Israel becomes a source of demonism. There's an open letter by Dennis Prager to Candace Owens, who said that Israel was founded by pedophiles and has been designed to protect pedophiles. And again, part of that is a way of regarding Israel as demonic. And we see the use of Nazi imagery to reinforce the demonic nature of Israel, including the notion that Israel is conducting genocide against the Palestinians. Now, I happen to be regarded, rightfully or wrongfully, I'll leave that to you to judge, to be regarded as an authority on genocide. And let me say the following, just so you can deal with it. Israel has an excuse to commit genocide. It has the capacity to commit genocide, namely, it has disproportionate power, and it has the opportunity to commit genocide. If it were committing genocide, it is doing a horrific job because, in a very basic way, the Palestinian population between the river and the sea has increased dramatically, so that one of the existential issues that Israel will have to face is what is going to be the relationship between 7 million Jews and 5 million Palestinians going forward. And there's a demographic issue that is enormously significant. That means that Israel has to conceive or reconceive the way in which it deals with its own population. But you do not have population expansion in that dramatic a way in a time in which you're committing genocide. You also don't have a pausing to get polio vaccination among the younger people. But why the identification of Israel with the Holocaust and the commission of genocide? Part of that is to get rid of the burdens that have fallen to the civilized world because of the fact that the Holocaust occurred. The Holocaust occurred with two of the great monotheistic religions, Judaism and Christianity, to a much lesser extent, Islam. And if I had been the president of Iran, I would have said essentially, Iran saved Jews during the Holocaust. Iran was a way station for people to come to Palestine. I would have pointed to the West and say, you great Westerners, look what you conducted, look what you did. Instead, Ahmadinejad denied the Holocaust, which in that sense is a subconscious desire, if not a conscious desire, to repeat it. But the other is, if you are challenging this, you're trying to get rid of the burden that had occurred in Western society with relationship to the Holocaust. So let's go back to where we are. And where we are is a very difficult time for Jewish life and for the Jewish people, because it essentially means that the direction that we chose for ourselves in the aftermath of World War II, which seemed to have been up to about 10, 15 years ago, one of the most dramatic success stories imaginable in Jewish history and even in human history, now seems to be unstable. And we're not sure that those two elements, which define the multiplicity of the ways 90% of the Jews live, both either in Israel or in the United States and Canada and the like. And that means the way in which the Jewish people have lived. And one of the ironic elements of Zionism, which we have to say, if you are anti-Zionist in one sense or another, you may be anti the Jewish future, because a plurality of the Jewish people now live in Israel, and a plurality, soon to be majority of the Jewish people, seem that they will soon continue to live in Israel. And that doesn't mean you have to identify with one or another form of Zionism, because there are multiple forms of Zionism. And one of the things, ironically, that we've learned in this period of time is that political Zionism has had three elements that were essential to political Zionism now are challenged. But cultural Zionism has succeeded in the most dramatic way. that people who hate their government are fighting life and death to preserve the society because of the quality of the society, the quality of its human relationships, the quality of its art, of its music, of its literature, of its poetry, of its religiosity, of its science, of its cultural aspects have dramatically increased. Now, let me explain to you what I mean so I'm clear. On political Zionism made three claims that it thought it could achieve. The first is it claimed essentially that it could protect the Jewish people. First of all, it claimed that it could become independent. The way for the Jews to create their future was to become independent. Little did it understand that we became independent precisely as the world became interdependent. And part of what we have to see in the relationship between Israel and all of the Arab countries, all of the European countries, and the United States, and even the way in which the war is being fought out on multiple fronts. And Iran is supplying weapons to Russia. And one of the attacks, if indeed Israel has severely damaged Iran's capacity to create missiles and drones, then one of the things it's done is to weaken Russia in its war against the Ukraine. So we promised independence in a world that has become independent. It promised security and an end to Jewish vulnerability. We have seen it altered the terms with which we respond to Jewish vulnerability. It has not ended Jewish vulnerability by any means, manner, or form. And the third thing is it promised normalcy. And the one thing the Jewish people have not been, and one of the things demonstrated now, is we have not been a normal people. In that sense, a nation like any other nation. I jokingly, and I have nephews, great nephews who are in the army and the like, and my blessing to my nephews when they go off to serve is may you have a boring week, may you have a boring month, may you have a boring time. I no longer wish them good news. I merely wish them that they be bored silly out of their service. The one thing we know about Jewish history by every aspect of it is what last year on Simchat Torah we had to listen to Israel under attack. This year on Simchat Torah we had to again what? Grapple in the diaspora, and it was Shabbat in Israel. We had to grapple with Israel that was in battle against Iran. This is not a normal environment. It's anything other than boring. And boring would be very good. Last point, and then I want to take questions so we have an opportunity to have a discussion because I've said an awful lot. What do we have to educate for at this point? And this is important to the work of the Haberman Institute. It's important to everything we do in Jewish life. My grandparents had the idea it was difficult to be a Jew. My parents found less and less difficulty being a Jew, and they felt for my generation that we would have no difficulty being a Jew. And we could, in my generation, not only be a Jew in private, but we could be deeply a Jew in public. We could wear this in public. We could put on a kippah in public. We could pray in public. We could demonstrate in public. We could march in public. We had a tremendous freedom to not only to do the words of emancipation, which was to be a Jew in your home and a person in the street. We could be a Jew in person. We could be a Jew in private, and the like. We could do that in all of that. So we now have to understand that our children's generation, our grandchildren's generation, it's going to be a lot tougher to be a Jew. Therefore, they have to understand the majesty of Jewish history, the mystery of Jewish history, the sanctity of Jewish history, the urgency of Jewish history, and most especially the joy of Jewish history. So they have to understand we're in it for and what Jewish existence is all about. We have to develop Jews who are tougher, who are prepared to handle the burden and the responsibility, and who have a certain toughness to them, and who can accept the vulnerability that comes with Jewish existence, because Jewish life has purpose, meaning, sanctity, sacredness, importance, significance, value. And that puts a tremendous burden on those of us who are educators to get on with the business of preparing a new generation for a time when it's not going to be easy to be Jewish, but it's going to be much more difficult. We have to make sure that civil society holds. Yesterday was the anniversary. By the way, when I say yesterday, I'm not sure what day it is in America and what day it is in Poland. So we've just turned a day, so it could be yesterday, could be the day before yesterday. So don't hold me to it, because I've lost a certain consciousness. But yesterday was the anniversary of the Tree of Life. And the Tree of Life taught us something very important, that if there is hatred against the Jewish people, the most effective response is for civil society to hold. The governor was there, the mayor was there, the district attorney was there, the police chief was there. The society came together, priests, and even in this case, priests and ministers, and the Muslim community committed $250,000 toward the Tree of Life. Pittsburgh Gazette said Kaddish on the front page of the newspaper, albeit with a mistake, but we won't hold them accountable for that. But there was an incredible thing. Pittsburgh Steelers and Pittsburgh Penguins put Jewish stars on their uniform, and the World Series had a moment of silence in memory of the Pittsburgh 11. And Mrs. Rogers, the widow of Mr. Rogers, who was the great moral teacher of our generation, came out with everybody else who was from Pittsburgh and said, this is not what we're going to allow to happen in our society. That means if civil society holds, then we have the possibility of defeating hatred by, again, showing that those who are in the mainstream of society are going to be committed to a pluralistic, serious society that protects the rights of all of its citizens, including Jews, not special rights, but the rights of all of its citizens, and keeps the Jewish community protected. In that sense, that's one of the major functions that we have to play. We can't withdraw from coalitions. We have to intensify coalitions. Let's, Matthew, take some questions. I see there are a number of questions in the chat. Let me look at them and let's see what we have. One person says, historically, has it been safer for Jews to live in a country with an autocratic system, provided the lead autocratic dictator is supportive of tolerance of Jews and clamps down on hate speech and violence toward Jews, versus an open democratic society where government does not stop the exercise of free speech or protests against Jews? Again, autocratic societies are enormously dangerous. We can point to loads of autocratic societies where the autocratic leader who came into power with a certain comfort level to the Jews turned against them. And part of what we have to say about protests is that protests have to end at the very moment when violence takes place and when threat takes place. You have the right of freedom of speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And there's certain speech that even if you are free to say it, should get a certain reprobate, a certain animus and a certain uh, uh, dismissal by the rest of society. Matthew, you said you wanted to answer that question as well.
Oh, I was just making it available for others to see the question so that they could see the words. I think when you click on the answer live button there, it allows everyone to see the question that you read out loud.
Young Jews have been strong in their faith through the demonstrations they are witnessing and participate currently a degree or disgrade. Let me say a couple of things. Not all news on anti-Semitism is bad. And let me give you, since I've given you a lot of bad news, let me give you some good news. In 2020, Judaism was the most respected religion in American life. Now, I say 2020, I'm interested to see what happens in 2024 and 5 when there's a new survey. And that the reason Judaism is the most respected of religions has less to do with Judaism and more to do with what's happening in other religions. The Roman Catholic Church is in tremendous turmoil because of all of the scandals regarding the priesthood and also the gap between the pulpit, and the pews. Protestantism is divided by between mainstream and evangelical. Evangelical is divided by age, with the younger generation in certain respects, like my kids, far more accepting of gays than the older generation, far more participating in the environment, and far less comfortable with the political alignment of the evangelical church with the Republican right. Let me also say that there's one part of that, which is that the younger generation is less supportive of Israel than the older generation. Islam also is generally connected with in the public mind with terrorism, and consequently, it is not that respected. So Judaism ends up being the most respected religion. The second element about anti-Semitism is Sartre once wrote a book, Anti-Semite and Jew, and asked the question, does it take the anti-Semite to make the Jew? And every Jew is now conscious of their Jewishness, for better or for worse, in a way that they were not conscious of it 10, 12, 14, 8, 10 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago. And that's occurring on every campus that I know of. Etc. So it's a very, in that sense, a very important element. How do we counter anti-Zionism, which currently appears in the most present form, a prevalent form of anti-Semitism? Number one, we have to indicate what Zionism is and what Zionism is not. And there are multiple forms of Zionism, and you have to ask somebody, just like up last year when you were on campus and somebody was chanting from the river and the sea, would you please tell me which river and which sea? And that is that there's a certain basic knowledge that is presumed. What form of Zionism are you against? I am, for example, deeply against the type of religious messianic Zionism that doesn't recognize the rights of other people. I am also against certain forms of militant anti-Semitism. My sister, who recently died, made Aliyah in 1972. Her generation had a certain view of Zionism that is radically different than the view that is prevalent today. They had a much more pure view of Zionism and a much more cultural view of Zionism. So which Zionism are you for? Which Zionism are you against? But Zionism in its two limited forms, the rights of the Jews to self-determination in a land of their own, that is Israel, and we can then deal with the question of what are the boundaries, what are the borders of Israel, and all of that, and one can have multiple forms of that. But the very question of, do Jews have the right to self-determination? Do Jews have roots in the land of Israel? These are essential elements of Zionism, and this is and the other is, this is the way in which the Jews have chosen to shape their future, and we have to respect the ways in which Jews have chosen to shape their future and be very supportive of that. How does assimilation play into anti-Semitism and vulnerability? Well, I'm not sure. We've seen assimilated Jews are now being. This is the unintended consequences of anti-Semitism. Assimilated Jews are now being reminded how Jewish they are, and they're not being asked about the nature of their Jewishness, and they feel a vulnerability, and in certain respects, they feel a different burden because they're not sure why and what for. They are labeled with this enormous heaviness of the responsibility for Jewish history, but they are. Somebody's writing from London, where I was yesterday. Thank you for your fascinating insights, Professor. Is there anything to be gained by promoting leadership Jews in every progressive Western movement, not just show business, but the arts, science, ecology, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, etc., and say it? Yeah, the answer to that is yes. And the answer to that also is that many Jews are feeling betrayed by a lack of reciprocity in the movements that they've been involved in. That doesn't mean that they were wrong to be involved in these movements, but also means that we haven't made a compelling case for who we are and what we are and what is represented by that. And we have to do that because we have ways of explaining who we are and what we're committed and the like. Can you expand about DEI and the state of the Jews at U.S. universities? Let me reiterate my basic point and expand on it a bit more. There are groups that have been higher in the totem pole of hatred. We can recite them. I could ask you all to form a list of them, but let me say in a basic way. The African American community has been targeted for much greater hatred than the Jewish community over a very, very long period of time. When my kids started driving, I did not have to have a conversation with my sons as to how they were to behave if they were stopped by the police. They were treated as white people. Immigrant groups are being targeted all over the place in every which way, manner, or form. Gays have traditionally been targeted in all sorts of ways. We're now having that it's less gays than more the targeting of transsexuals and the like have been targeted. Immigrants, Hispanics, a whole range of populations have been targeted. The university has gone out of its way for very good and important reasons to now make room and feel itself as supporting these populations. And the end unintended, or perhaps intended, but I can't document that, the unintended consequence of that has been that the Jews are the one group that is in a minority that does not feel that it is being responded to and being protected. So this is not to say that DEI is wrong, and I understand that it's not wrong, but that DEI, it's not to say that DEI is wrong. but it's to say that there has to be a sensitivity to the vulnerability of the Jews in a very basic way. I have a question here that I must answer because, Sandy, it is from a man by the name of Dr. Arnie Schwartz. And Arnie Schwartz has known me longer than you've known me, because Arnie Schwartz was in my elementary school class, and we go back a very, very long way. A major existential Jews and the future of the USA is the loss of Jewish identity and membership in the non-affiliation, lack of Jewish educational language, history, my comments. Yeah, look, we have, I've been writing about this for years. Almost all Jews are Jews by choice. That doesn't mean, I'm not talking about conversion. They're choosing to make something of their Jewishness. And I believe that we need to be high intensity Jews who do something very serious and very important with our Jewishness, make it meaningful and substantive and value giving in a sense of community and a sense of purpose. In my mind, a sense of sacredness and a sense of holiness and the like. Or there's not enough there to keep us away. And what we're finding now is that the more assimilated Jews are finding that they're having to choose one way or the other. And one of the sad things to see on campus is the people who are confronted with the idea of, are you or are you not a Zionist? And who are forced, as it were, to deny their identity or even to confront their identity in order to go forward and to be allowed. So one of the problems in American society has been essentially that Jews have been allowed to acculturate and assimilate and have been welcome. And we're now seeing there are places in which and things in which Jews are not welcome. I'm asked if I'm in favor of a two-state solution. Let me say this, that I said before that only an anti-Semite could believe that the people of Israel have the government that they deserve, and only an anti-Semite and anti-Palestinian can believe that the people of Palestine have the leadership that they deserve. There could have been a Palestinian state in 1947 and 48. There could have been a Palestinian state in the year 2000, when it was an agreement that was reached between Prime Minister Barak and President Clinton, and Yasser Arafat decided to go to Intifada 2. There could have been a Palestinian state in 2008 with the agreement of Ehud Olmert and the like. And what we have at this point is the Palestinians have, in the words of Abba Eban, never lost an opportunity to lose an opportunity. Pay attention to one of the strategies, and this is important in terms of Palestinian leadership, that somebody is now coming in from the wilderness, a man by the name of Fayyad, Prime Minister Fayyad. Prime Minister Fayyad was was a prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, who was deeply committed to actually forming a state and understood that actually forming a state meant that you needed a state and you needed a monopoly of power, and a state could only be formed by making peace with its neighbor and would never have the possibility of it. If you ask me, and I'm going to say this briefly, but it's a much more complex thing. I don't believe that there can be peace at this moment. I think we should be thinking as a model of divorce. And in a divorce, you understand that you cannot live in the same house, you cannot share the same bed, that you need a major economic separation, and that hopefully you can get along with a minimum of antagonism so you don't destroy your children. the comparable element with regard to the Palestinians and the Jews living in the land of Israel is they ultimately have to work the land of Israel. And I say this as somebody who many years ago was in charge of sanitation for Jerusalem, both sides of Jerusalem, and therefore know the consequences of the entire sewer systems involved. And that is, unless Palestinians and Israelis get along, they will destroy the land from an ecological point of view. The basic element of sewers functions on gravity, and consequently, they have to make sure they get along well enough not to destroy the entire land. But that's my view. Why the reaction Tree of Life so much more positive than the reaction October 7th, which was greeted with celebration? Look, October 7th was not only greeted with celebration. October 7th was greeted with trauma. I think the American government, we had the president of the United States went over to Israel in a time of war and expressed solidarity. There was virtual uniform support in the Congress of the United States. There was celebration in a variety of different places, but the majority of the response was, again, that October 7th was horrible. The most interesting thing to observe on the campus was that the protests against October 7th began before the Israelis decided to respond, how they were going to respond at all to what happened on October 7th. So it was on the campuses of the United States, it seemed to have been very well orchestrated on the campus of the United States, that the response took the form of celebration, and a whole range of things came out of the closet. One is going to have to understand the economic support for that. One's going to have to understand the cultural and the ideological support of that. I've been asked to comment about Saudi Arabia. Let me say the following, because it's important. Israel, and if you read Startup Nation, what Startup Nation can essentially say, let's go back. In 1973, when we had the oil crisis, we all believed maybe Moses made the wrong turn, that had he gone right instead of left, he would have left the Jewish people with a great deal more power because they would have been in charge of the global reserves of oil. We thought that power in the last part of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, would be in control of natural resources. We found something very different, that power in the last third of the last quarter, 20th century, first quarter of the 21st century has not been in control of natural resources, but in the ability to control and deal with knowledge-based economies. Saudi Arabia is undergoing a dramatic transition because it built its society on the idea that fossil fuels would be the foundation of the country. It's trying now to move to a knowledge-based economy. In a knowledge-based economy, Israel is not necessarily an enemy, but an ally. And knowledge-based economy, you have to deal with 100% of your population, not 50% of your population. And hence, whether you like it or not, whether you're ideologically committed to it or not, whether you're religiously committed to it or not, you have to give women a sense of participation in that knowledge-based economy. And consequently, Saudi Arabia is the potential reward to ally with Israel because it trusts, frankly, the Jews with a bomb more than it trusts Iran with a bomb. And it sees its future moving to a knowledge-based economy in which Israel becomes an ally. And furthermore, Israel has one more thing it can supply to Saudi Arabia because of its desalinization program, which is the most basic element of all human life, which is a 5-letter word, WATER, water. And that also is there. The Biden administration, which has a strategy, we're not sure it's realizable. We're not sure if either of the candidates will continue it. The Biden administration believes that the way forward is to have the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia give Israel a sense of overwhelming security and acceptance in the Middle East. The price for that would be a horizon to the recognition of Palestinian national rights in some form or another. And that would be the tremendous stance against the Iranian hegemony in the Middle East. All of those are a jigsaw puzzle. It makes perfect intellectual sense. But as you know, intellectual ideas do not necessarily serve as blueprints for political outcomes, much more complex and the like. I'm going to avoid because it's 2 weeks it's 10 days before the election. I'm going to avoid the direct political response. I know we have limited time. What's my feeling about Neturei Karta? Neturei Karta are those Haredi Jews who believe that we should wait to the Messiah, and consequently everything the Zionists do is illegitimate. They have been supportive of Iran against Israel. I think that we have to reject the Neturei Karta as enormously extreme, and that they do not demonstrate a significant love for the Jewish people in a variety of ways. What historical texts have the greatest value for Jews? What am I reading? What's on my reading list? Let me begin by saying I'm the father of 4 children, and I always joke I don't have a favorite child. I have a rotating least favorite child. So I am an omnivorous reader of Jewish text. And depending on which Jewish text I'm reading at which time, that's my love at that time. I read an awful lot of history. I clearly have to read, and nobody can keep up in my field of Holocaust studies. I read the Hebrew Bible voraciously. I had been through most of Daf Yomi, and I'm waiting for them to catch up to where I left off, to at least finish 1 round of Daf Yomi. And maybe if I ever retire, I will finish, and I'm blessed to live long enough, I'll finish a 2nd round of Daf Yomi. I love historical writings, and I love Jewish history and the like. I'm asked a question, with the rate of intermarriage so high, do we have a future here? I don't believe we should give up. I think that number one, Jews by choice who have chosen to go on the Jewish journey have constituted some of the most wonderful Jews I know, most interesting Jews I know, most solidly Jews I know. And the other thing, we found something else, which is that we Jews, demographically, if let's say there are 5.4 million Jews in America today, and I don't know if that figure is accurate because I'm not up to date on that. I depend on, whenever I quote that, I depend on 2 very wonderful Jewish demographers to say that. We probably have another several million people who have ancestral ties to the Jewish people, and consequently who have a stake in Jewish history. We have, interestingly enough, we have a presidential candidate who is has Jewish grandchildren, another presidential candidate who has a Jewish husband. We have a president who has part of his family is intermarried with Jews who are committed Jews. You just had in Chile one of the last of the Beatles at Yom Kippur services with his Jewish wife. I mean, there are resources that are involved in that. And I don't know of any liberal synagogue and very few modern Orthodox synagogues that don't have several Jews by choice who are now the mainstream of their congregation, who are wonderful. And look at what happened when we had the kidnapping in Colleyville, Texas. They wanted to speak to the rabbi, the guy who attempted to take it over wanted to speak with the rabbi of Central Synagogue, never imagining that because he didn't realize Central Synagogue was named after Grand Central Terminal, and Central Synagogue he thought was the height of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the great center of power that controlled it all. And who is the rabbi? The rabbi is an Asian a Jew, an Asian woman Jew, who all of a sudden represents this. So we Jews have always been able to, many years ago, Gershon Cohen, who was the chancellor of Jewish Theological Seminary, wrote something called The Blessings of Assimilation, by which he probably today would have said of acculturation, which is we have always borrowed the best of the societies in which we lived in and Judaized them. You can't think, for example, of Jewish music from Eastern Europe, one of the least assimilated societies, without understanding what Ukrainian and Polish folk tunes were, what Gypsy, Roma, and Sinti folk tunes were, the music that was established there. Chazanut owes an awful lot to German Jewry and to what was involved with that. Think of it this way. No Orthodox wedding today is replete without a sushi display as part of the smorgasbord. Now, when did sushi become a Jewish dish? And you got to then ask, when did gefilte fish become a Jewish dish? When did chopped liver become a Jewish dish? When did hummus become a Jewish dish? Think of it in terms of music. Think of it in terms of art. Think of it in terms of literature. Because we have lived everywhere, we have absorbed, we have transformed, and we have Judaized. And that's been part of the secret for our vigor and part of the secret for what some have called the genius of the Jews. And we've rejected some very bad stuff over a very long period of time. Going back to the Psalms, if you think of the way in which they describe idolatry. And I hope we'll continue to reject some very bad things. I believe that, Matthew, my time is up, unfortunately.
Yes, yeah, unfortunately we can't get to all the questions, but
Let me answer only
Yeah.
one more
Sure.
to take. We'll go over time for one more. What do I think about Coates's one-sided report about occupation? Will it become Palestinian manifesto? Let me say that anybody who thinks after a 2 or 3 week visit to the occupied territories or to the West Bank, he or she becomes an expert on Israel is unimaginably uninformed. He gave the Palestinians no agency. He merely saw them as victims without imagining that they had a role in their fate and their outcome. He makes some valid and difficult points with regard to the cost of the cost to Israel and to the Palestinians of Israeli occupation and over a long period of time. But he believes he understands and knows much more than he actually knows, and nobody becomes capable of writing on that basis anything that roughly resembles a treatment that has to be taken seriously by history.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Professor Berenbaum, for sharing all of this wonderful expertise and wisdom with us and tackling all these insightful questions. I'm glad that so many were able to join us this evening, and I hope that so many more will watch the recording. And I know that I'm going to share the recording with as many people as possible, including my family and community. So thank you again. And thank you all out there for joining us for this very engaging session. I hope you all enjoyed the learning, as difficult as it is to hear, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on our next some of our next programs coming up in the next month. So
Thank you.